make sure that you understand what you're doing in the tool before you do said thing in the tool, right? Like, that's probably, like, we've seen large cases where someone thought they were applying a file type exclusion, right, to a single server or endpoint, when in reality they were star.star, ignore all scans for all email incoming for the entirety of the environment, right?
And the last thing I'll bookend on before doing the intro here is, said another way, fusion centers aren't new. Cyber is just getting mature enough to be able to take advantage of the concept, right? It was really, in many ways, an early 2000s intelligence concept that, like, has started to be, made available across industries, and now it's to the point where it can be offered as a service, right? We don't need to go that far into plugging, but I'm just saying that is
no, but I think that
regulations, right, have already happened. It's like history repeating itself type deal, and it's just like, well, we could have already seen where we could have been, and that's where we're at. So now we're here. Let's keep going, right? Let's see what else, like, what other pieces are improvements, what other things can.
What other things are out there that people with similarly structured missions have done? What is intelligence did that in the early 2000s? What are they doing now?
What was
right? How can we learn better from that as a way to turn that into commercial cyber?
Yeah, that's some good thought. I mean, when I think about it, my headspace has been law enforcement and terrorism fusion centers started happening when the problem sets became so complex that traditional methods couldn't solve them, right? So, and I think that's a lot of what we're starting to see in cyber as well, is these more difficult problem sets, more organized, criminal activity. And so it's just going to naturally require us to have more tools, more communication, leading to, cyber fusion centers. So,
I mean, if you think about it too, right? Like, the people who are attacking things, right? They are doing it themselves. So it's just kind of repeating the same process, except for now your colo, right, is actually just other companies that are using your services, providing you some extra information. You can say that this person is using, this person's in fintech. What other clients do I have that are fintech related, and how can I help them do the same thing while it's making this collaborative move without the client or anyone actually really knowing about it, right? Like, that's just something that that is capable of being done.
So one thing that you just hit on, Joel, is that, and I believe what you're referring to, many people say would have a bit of an overlap with ISACs. I don't actually think that's the case.
Over the left outside corner, because fuck you.
If you were an easier batter to work with, I wouldn't have to do that, but you're not going to score on me every game.
Okay, so what other types of... So I thought you were going one direction with that question, and just as an example would be, and one of the reasons, the free tool, the Slack is a great is a great point out, right? Of why stay with Slack or use Slack instead of Teams. So the thing I'll bring most recently, right, is there's a couple of examples. Intune and Mac management, right, is a great example of, if you want heavy Mac configuration, you shouldn't use Intune. Right? It's free. It can do the basics. You can check the compliance box that you have Mac management, right? But you are going to smash your head into the keyboard, right, repeatedly trying to do it without something like Jamf, right? So that's another example of where tool choice makes your security environment, yes, you're checking the compliance box theoretically the same with both of those solutions, right? But actual, impact from a security perspective, configuration, ease of use, right, automation, etc., like Jamf is going to blow Intune away right now. Right now, that may change in the future. Microsoft, even just recently added more features on the iOS side, right? So that's the thing that is nice about that, is when you are integrated into that suite, you do get those new features that come in, but at the same time, you're also a slave to the Microsoft development roadmap, right?
So the one that I'm going to pick on Joel for, because what I think I heard is basically when the integrated tool set, which, by the way, I think that's the word that you've both said is integration. And so the reason why you pick a tool set, and the Cyber Fusion Center fundamentally is all about integration. So you got to pick tools that integrate nicely together in order to support the concept of a fusion center, right? So that's should be self-evident, but that's my job as a moderator here, is to say the self-evident thing. So what I think I heard you say, Jay, and I think is a really good point, because I didn't even think of the Jamf Intune thing. I had a more specific one. That's one that Joel likes to talk about every once in a while with CrowdStrike versus Defender. But in the case of what you said, what I'm hearing is when the integrated tool doesn't do the job that you need it to do, and that's based on your own threat model, your own risk tolerance, all the normal cybersecurity caveats that we're all used to giving. If there's a gap there, that's when it makes sense to either augment, because Jamf does a really good job of working with Intune in a very integrated manner, or to rip and replace, as the case of CrowdStrike would be. And so my question to Joel then is that okay? That's like almost a self-evident one with Macs. I'm actually, now that I say I'm surprised by it, it's just because it's not controversial. There's no question. If you want to have a secure Mac environment and you're a Microsoft shop, Jamf is I don't know of another solution. Maybe there is one. Certainly not one that's FedRAMPed, but that's neither here nor there. When is it good to do something that's a little bit more, what's the right word? Less obvious. It's less obvious, not more, it's less. In fact, this is like CrowdStrike versus Defender is a much less obvious decision point when to do that. The decision point for what AJ said is, well, how many Macs do you have and how much critical data is on those Macs? It's very simple. CEO has one Mac and we don't let him touch anything. Use Intune. Who cares? Right. But if you have like what we have here, where we're really big on developer tool choice, and we really want everybody to come in to be, it's like the least important thing it's so important to a developer and such a low percentage add-on for IT in a corporation to be comfortable in your own environment. Right? That's the world of difference for software engineers and people of that type. Corporate's different, but when you have a team of software engineers and you don't let them work in the environment they're comfortable in, you're just throwing good money after bad. So that's why we believe in it. But what's that tipping point? And again, tipping point for that's obvious. What's the tipping point for something less obvious? And I'm going to pick on Joel because I know you like CrowdStrike.
I mean, okay, so one of the parts why I do like CrowdStrike so much is the fact that if you want any bit of information, you can get it all. You get all the telemetry, you get everything. It doesn't hold anything back, right? I actually feel like the interface, right? If we're going to go interface kind of styling, I think Defender just, it loads up everything really slowly. It easily adds 3 to 5 minutes for an investigation that should be relatively easy. You can't multitask it. You can't you can't make it expand out all of the components in one single view, right? And it's easily exportable on the CrowdStrike side. So it depends on what is the magnitude that you're doing this into the environment. So I would say if I'm dealing with more than, if I'm dealing with, I'm just trying to give a freaking number right now. Let's just say 30 alerts a day that are happening on the on the endpoint side. I would way rather do that on CrowdStrike than I would on Defender. Defender, like, just doing the math there, right? It's 150 minutes.
Yeah.
So
the thing I want to tie one thing you just said, Joel, into something that Matt said earlier, right? Which was all of this. I want to bring it back to risk management as well, right? Which is the decisions that we're making about selecting or paying for something or ripping and replacing or prioritize one thing or the other should always be coming back to, am I doing this from a risk managed perspective? And what I mean by that is, Matt, you called out a thing like if there's a key feature missing, right, for a thing that you need, right, and being comfortable in your environment, understanding that nice to haves are not need to haves, right? And I'm going to say the same thing, Joel, right? Which is, as a CISO, if you're coming to me and saying, hey, boss, I have 30 investigations. It's going to take me an extra 90 minutes of analyst time a day to do these because I'm using Defender, right? That's some pretty quick math on maybe a cost difference of several $100,000, right? And you come back to me and I say, oh, that's great, but I need to spend a couple $100,000 on WAF or whatever it may be. That's higher up on my risk management profile. So as long as, I would say, as practitioners, when we are selecting tools, right, and designing something and building something, that we are doing it for progress over perfection, right? That's what I worry about a lot of companies doing is like, oh, I got to have the best in CrowdStrike, and I got to have Jamf, right? And you got to have the Bugatti of everything, right? And it's just not the case. That is not how you build it and are successful in a fusion center.
I mean, like just the moments of people, like a great example is where people are absolutely doing that, where I'm going to stand up my environment and I want everything that like top notch stuff. And it's like, you don't even know what like, how many logs you're going to be ingesting. You don't even know how many people you have that you're going to have within the next 2 years. You don't know like how noisy your environment is because you're not logging anything at this particular time, right? You haven't tuned your main, let's just say, your Entra ID, right? You haven't even tuned that. You haven't tuned Azure as a whole. You haven't done anything, and they're just like, let's just throw money at everything. And it's, it fits the bill, it checks the box and things like, but you kind of shot too quickly, and and at the end, and then we've even come into the aftermath of that kind of situation where they have, 1/3 of the products that they have purchased aren't even being utilized in any capacity. It is installed and halfly implemented, and halfly implemented into their environment, but the policies or configurations aren't even done. So I don't know. Like it's to your point, right? It's that balance. Is that great balance that they need to have, and also just that level of self control.
And the thing I would come back with is, again, when you're selecting tools for your cyber fusion center, if you're actually going to build your own internal cyber fusion center, right? POC, 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 POC. Like, if you better freaking POC, right? Because, especially if you're in that smaller business space or you're looking at things, we've already named a couple of products, I guess, or I guess we're not going to pull off mittens or gloves on bashing products, right? But if you go and buy a Sophos CDR, right, and they're like, oh man, we can do 17 things, and you look at their cloud panel, right, and it has a ton of capability in there, right? But I think I'm not going to quote him, but he's another IANS faculty member that basically said the farther that you go down on that stack, the less mature that it gets. Basically, as they were just buying and sticking right things on there, and we go into client environments and they're having to build hundreds and hundreds of exceptions, right, to get something to work inside their environment. So it's really just be cognizant of what's in your environment and what your requirements are, and the difference between a must-have and a need-to-have. That is risk prioritized.
And so we talked about prioritization. Let's talk a little bit about cost, right? What are some cost-effective tips that you could give to, especially those in the SMB and mid-market that are starting to learn and understand, hey, I pay a big MSSP bill, I pay for this, I have a cyber threat intelligence stream. What are ways that people can prepare themselves or build an organization that can fit into this well?
Let me make sure I understand the question. So what are some of the ways that from a business perspective, that you can build an organization to fit into that kind of model?
Correct. How do you prepare for it, right? So it's organizationally, it's in terms of tools, investments. An example, and again, wouldn't work for us because of our developer choice thing, but an example of being like, hey, we only do Chromebooks, or we only pick a single Windows laptop, right? Like, what are ways that people can make it easier to do it? And I'll just speak because we all have shared experiences with customers that will pick that's the thing I want button without necessarily looking at it in terms of the overall security program. And then they're like, well, why does this cost so much money? And the answer is because you picked choices that weren't optimal for the program you were trying to create, right? Like it's there, and we've said, as the example, Microsoft's the easy button. They've got everything and they've really built their whole suite for compliance. But as with Slack, as with Jamf, as with CrowdStrike, and there are different needs an organization may have where they feel like they can't just take the easy button there to do that. They want to do more. And so we've talked about that tipping point, but like, what can people do to help ready themselves for these decisions? Because like you said, this is new. So a lot of people would say Fusion Center's on our 2025 roadmap, right? So what can they do in 24 to get there in terms of, and that could be hiring, that could be technology choices, it could be a lot of different things.
Okay.
So
That we can go a lot of different ways with
yeah,
that.
some immediate like things that I could come up with would be like one example would be like dictate your fleet, right? Make sure that it's all something that can be readily available. Like if you're gonna go Dell, go two options of Dell: workstation replacement and mobile, right? Stick with Windows if you can, if just for the ease and capabilities of that. But if you're going to have Mac side, then limit that for a reason. Don't make it just let people just choose. Also, anything that has to do with like your environment, right? Your Active Directory or user control systems. Um, Leaving that, like, it may sound like a waste of time to dictate departments, dictate groups, dictate all of that stuff now. Doing that now is going to save you way more hours and headaches and redoing in the future, right? Um, because again, in the end, the common saying, right? It's you don't know what you don't know, and you can't protect the things you don't know, right? And if you can't define that early on in the days of your business, then there's a reason why a lot of people go out of business too, right? It's not just because of the fact that they didn't plan for something in the future, but it's also for the fact that they just didn't plan to plan, and they make poor choices, and it's the amount of poor choices that they make towards the end that make them fail. It's not one, it's not two, it's a multitude of bad choices. So, dictating fleet, investing early in kind of the construction of your business, right? And then also, maybe not enrolling in 5-year terms, right? Make sure that the things that you're freaking leasing or the things that you're, invested in are something that are flexible in the end, right? If your projection is in 2024, 2025, and you started your business in 2022, I really hope you weren't in a 5-year, projection of like being invested in a tool, because in 5 years that may be the worst tool, or they may, it's just you're stuck with it, right? And now you're ready to progress, but you're still stuck with a antiquated feature set that everyone else has blown it out of the water at this point. And
That's a good one. That's one I didn't think of, and we've definitely run across, right? Is people that feel like they need to get their value worth of the tools that they've bought, even though those tools just don't meet the functional needs. Forget the compliance needs, but like the actual organizational needs. I think that's definitely one that I didn't think about in terms of preparedness.
And I'll take a little bit of a different, I would say, approach on it. From one, know where you're trying to go and what you're trying to achieve, right, from a business objective, and ask how the tools that you're selecting fit into that. Does that make it easier or harder for you to do? Right. So as a business, if you are trying to achieve, one of the hot topics in Fed space is CMMC compliance, right? Understand why you're trying to achieve that. What are the requirements for that, right? And does what you're wanting to do match up with what you should be doing, right? Or are you going to be costing yourself more money in the long run because you prefer option A over option B when really option B is the better choice, right? So that would be kind of point one. Point two for me is I like to tell people, right, like if you're a smaller shop, so one, I'll just make the comment, a small to medium business should not be trying to start their own cyber fusion center, right? You are going to have a hard time, if not impossible time, staffing it, right? And you will spend far more money than you should, right? Go out and find a managed service provider to do it for you. On the managed service provider front, right, in that aspect is find a managed service provider that will advise you properly is the short answer, right? Because there are lots of times where we sit in, right, and listen to other advisors, right? So I'm trying to think of the right way to say it, but is be careful who you trust, right? Is the Aesop's fable of the Emperor's New Clothes, right? Where he trusted all of his wise men and ended up being naked, right? Because he didn't challenge or didn't want to seem stupid. So, be careful who you turn the keys over to, right? When you're selecting those. So if you're preparing for a cyber fusion center, it is make sure that you have an advisor that has either done that, right? I don't know, say either has been there, done that, right? Like, how can anyone advise you on how to build a cyber fusion center if they have not done so? Pick a framework, right? If you're a small business, right, pick something like CIS 18 and go against that and just say, okay, what are some of the free tools out there there's a ton of great content in the open source community, right? I'll plug a couple of them, and just as a side note, right? I'm gonna miss some, right? But like, there's a community edition of Bloodhound, right? There's a community edition of Ping Castle, right? There's a ton of tools that are out there. There's a community edition of Snipe It, right? Thanks Snipeyhead for developing an awesome tool, right? For IT asset management stuff, right? All of those are free that you don't necessarily, free, right? They're open source software. You do have to run them and administer them. But that's what I would do at first, is sit down and if you're trying to hold a budget close, right? Sit down and say, what are some of the open source tools that I can start, right, down the path of progress, right? It is progress over perfection, right? It is introducing friction, right? So security in layers, right? So by even using some of these free tools, which are not as good, right, as the commercial paid tools, you're still hardening your environment. So that's what I would say is, and then I'm going to get my last plug is people, process, and technology in that order for a reason, right? Don't go buy technology and then try to force your process into it because somebody told you that CrowdStrike was the best EDR ever. Okay. So picked on Joel specifically. I didn't even get a reaction. I'm disappointed.
No, I mean, I agree. Right when you said people, process, technology, that's absolutely true, right? Like that's the balance, right? That is the straight balance. And if any of those fall, like that's where your focus should be, right? If you don't have enough people, it's time to hire, right? If you don't have the technology, well, okay, well, why don't you have the technology, right? Like, do you have something that's close to it or whatever, right? And then it's time to start reviewing your contracts that you have. Be ready to replace that technology with something that's bigger, better, faster, right? If you can.
Yep.
And yeah.
All I will say is there are some really great organizations out there, ours included. I'm gonna lump ours into one of them, right? That really believe in mission, right, and helping the customer secure their environment, right? And so go find providers like that, right? They do exist out there. Go find advisors that are like that, and we can get into a whole rant on VCSO and hourly based VCSO over objective based VCSO, amongst other things, but that's what I would say to people is build your vision, match your business goals against it, make sure you have the proper advisor in place, take a framework that you're going to align against, right? And then look for open source tools that are going to help you make progress over perfection, and then figure how you can fill those gaps.
And so in kind of a closing thought here, what are some mistakes that you've seen as people try to roll out these security programs and forgetting they don't know that they need a cyber fusion center? They're not there yet, but they are buying these elements of detection and threat intelligence and incident response, etc. So like what are some mistakes that you would say that you've seen that you could generically caution people against as they start to mature in this process?
Make sure that you understand what you're doing in the tool before you do said thing in the tool, right? Like that's probably, like, we've seen large cases where someone thought they were applying a file type exclusion, right, to a single server or endpoint, when in reality they were star.star, ignore all scans for all email incoming for the entirety of the environment, right? It is, don't assume that the engineers in your environment, just because they are capable, right, automatically know how to best configure, implement, stand up, optimize these security tools, right? And don't attempt to just lump on, other duties as assigned, right, to your engineers and say, congratulations, you are now responsible for the configuration of our Azure firewalls. And that person's like, cool, what's Azure, right? So, and I think Joel's called something out earlier too, right? Like signing long year terms with new tools that you've not used before, not putting like if you do sign a 1 year term, put something in the renewal clause that says you can't jack up my price by 100% on the second year, right? Just because I want to renew it, right? So I mean, I think we could talk about mistakes for a very long time, but those are some.
That's why I just said some of the top ones. You're right. There's a lot of them.
Yeah. I have one and I lost it because it was
Joel,
in the middle of the rant.
What you remember the Sentinel like connection hub versus like that's a really easy one to make, right? That was done previously of how the connector was content
Oh
hub.
yeah, like Sentinel, yeah, the content hub versus like where its connections were. Like basically, like yeah, that's a huge one. Where if you weren't paying attention to it, right, Microsoft was basically saying for months that this change was going to happen, and then they literally, when the date happened, it flipped, and essentially their data connectors and their content hub, the data connector as like the section disappeared and now became content hub, and then you had to install those as individual pieces. It felt and used like the same way, but it's from a different section, and even though it retained um, the a lot of the connections for you, right? Microsoft did its best to be able to transition things as well as it could. I'll tell you what, man, easily like 60% of the analytics that were associated to the data connectors were not brought in from the content hub, and that was just either turned off or gone, right? Or reverted into its own like tuned back to like out of the box tuning. So like that made us have to go through and start redeveloping our detections and stuff for for those
And
spaces.
yeah, and to me that just calls out like that's a very specific nuance on one product area. Like if you
Yeah,
look at the releases, the release cadence that Microsoft does, right, on a monthly basis, and you expect your 7-person security team to keep up with all of that on all of the tools, like you're it's a recipe for disaster.
absolutely. And also, I also feel like enough people aren't asking the question why, right? Like that's another like big, big flaw is, they see something and it's like, just ask why. Just be
Mm.
curious. Want to understand your environment. So if I ask you why, it's not because I'm calling you out. It's not because I think you're doing it wrong. I just don't know, and the process just looks silly. And then how do you make it better? Is it?
Yeah, if something doesn't make sense, ask, right? Is
Yeah.
really what it comes down to. And that's a cultural thing, right? That I
Yep.
really think starts at the top. And as a leader, you if something doesn't make sense to you, you can't just be the magnanimous, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm gonna sit here, right? It's I don't understand. Help me understand. Right? Because someone else in the room is asking that same question. If you can build that kind of culture in your environment, you're nailing the head, man. Like
Yeah.
you have to be inquisitive.
I mean, AJ asks me why all the time, and I constantly say like, it's probably because of this. And I go and I look. Yep, I was right. It was because of this. We figured it out. It's fine. I still went and looked for it. I tried to find the answer, but being asked why makes me then have to be like, okay, now I have to answer. But then there's even moments of where that has even trickled down, where it's just like, yes, why? And I'm like, I don't know. Hey, why is it like this? And it happens again. And you get a better group of people as well when everyone is in the same inquisitive hive mind, right?
Yep.
And then information spreads much more freely.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for your time this afternoon. Have a happy holiday. Really appreciate everyone's time, and thanks to all of our listeners for another installment of This Is Fine.